The melody arrived not as a memory, but as a presence. It moved through the sterile air of the penthouse like a ghost, a whisper of a song he hadn't truly heard in 30 years, a tune that wealth couldn't buy and power could never command. Julian Croft, a man whose name was a synonym for ruthless success, sat alone in the cavernous silence of his home, a glass palace suspended over the glittering, indifferent heart of New York City. The city lights, a chaotic constellation of human endeavor, offered no warmth, reflecting only the vast emptiness within him. In his hand, he cradled the only object that held any genuine value in his life, a small, sterling silver locket, its surface worn smooth by the phantom touch of a ghost's fingers and the constant, anxious worry of his own. He didn't need to open it to see the image within, a faded photograph of a young woman with eyes that held a quiet, knowing sorrow. The very same sorrow he now saw mirrored in his own reflection against the dark glass of the window. Her name was Lelia, a name that felt like a prayer and a curse on his tongue. He didn't belong here, in this meticulously curated mausoleum of success, surrounded by abstract art that left him cold, and furniture so perfect it seemed to repel human touch. He belonged to a memory, a fragile mosaic of sensations from a life before this one, the faint, almost forgotten scent of lavender and rain, the feeling of small hands kneading dough, and the sound of that lullaby. It was a melody of profound simplicity, yet it held the entire architecture of his childhood, a world built of love and whispered secrets, a world that had imploded the day his mother had been taken from him in a senseless, brutal accident. He had spent the subsequent 3 decades building an empire of steel, silicon, and code, a fortress of finance designed to wall off the echoing silence she had left behind. He had conquered markets, crushed competitors, and amassed a fortune that could alter the fates of nations. But the silence remained, a stubborn, undefeated tenant in the penthouse of his soul. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't articulate, the ghost of her song was louder than ever, a painful, beautiful ache that finally drove him from his gilded cage. He needed air. He needed noise. He needed anything other than the suffocating perfection of his own creation. He walked without purpose, a man adrift in a city of millions. He had left his driver, his security, his entire apparatus of power behind. The sky had opened up, a torrential summer downpour that soaked his bespoke suit and $5,000 leather shoes in seconds. The rain was a great equalizer, stripping him of his meticulously crafted persona, rendering him anonymous. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man who had lost a desperate fight with the world. And in that moment, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. His aimless wandering led him to the glowing entrance of the Gilded Compass, the flagship restaurant of the Meridian Hotel Group, a company that had recently appeared on his acquisition radar. It was a palace of manufactured elegance, a stage where the city's elite performed their nightly ritual of status and consumption. On a whim, born of utter emptiness and a primal need to be somewhere anywhere other than his own head, he pushed through the absurdly heavy brass and glass doors. The wave of warm air that greeted him was thick with the scent of money, earthy truffles, aging wine, expensive perfume, and an underlying metallic tang of ambition. The hostess, a willowy blonde with a smile as brittle as spun sugar, took one look at his drenched, disheveled appearance, and her expression curdled with an almost comical speed. Her professional veneer cracked, revealing a bedrock of pure disdain. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice a finely tuned instrument of dismissal. The emphasis on the word help suggested he was a problem to be solved, a piece of litter to be swept away. "A table, for one," Julian said, his voice raspy from disuse. Her eyes performed a swift, contemptuous audit, cataloging his soaked jacket, his unkempt hair, his lack of a designer watch. The verdict was clear. "I'm dreadfully sorry, sir. We are fully booked for the evening." It was a lie, as transparent as the crystal glasses gleaming on the dozen or so empty tables scattered throughout the opulent room. Before Julian could formulate a response that 30 years ago might have been pleading, but now would have been laced with a cutting irony. A man with greased-back hair and a suit that was just a little too tight for his frame glided over. His movements were slick, reptilian. His gold name tag, catching the light from the chandelier, read Marcus Thorne, Manager. His smile was a predatory slash in his pale face, an expression that didn't come close to reaching his cold, calculating eyes. "Is there a problem here, Clarice?" he asked, his voice a low thrum of artificial hospitality. He didn't look at Julian. He looked past him, as if he were a particularly unpleasant stain on the marble floor. "This gentleman was just leaving," Clarice said, a conspiratorial smirk playing on her lips. She was learning from her master. Marcus's gaze finally fell upon Julian, and the disdain was so pure, so unadulterated, it was almost fascinating. It was a look Julian hadn't received in decades, not since he was a scholarship kid at a boarding school full of old money heirs. It was the look of someone dismissing another human being as utterly, irredeemably worthless. It was, in a strange way, exhilarating. It was real. "I see," Marcus said, his lips curling. "Sir, this is a fine dining establishment. Perhaps a diner down the street would be more suitable to your budget." He spoke the word budget as if it were a contagion. It was then that a quiet voice, possessed of a strange, weary clarity, cut through the thick tension. "There is a small table free in my section. It's by the service corridor, but it's a table. He can have that one." All three of them turned. A waitress stood holding a heavy tray laden with dirty dishes, her posture betraying a deep, bone-weary fatigue. Yet her face, though tired and lined with worry, held a defiant kindness in her eyes. Her uniform was immaculate, but visibly worn at the cuffs and collar. Her name tag, pinned slightly askew, read Elena. She looked directly at Julian, not with pity, which he would have hated, but with a simple, unassuming decency that was as shocking in this environment as a wild flower growing through concrete. Marcus's face tightened into a mask of reptilian fury. He rounded on her, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. Elena, we have discussed this. You do not make decisions in my restaurant. Your job is to clear plates, take orders, and smile. It is not your place to invite every piece of street refuse that wanders in from the rain. Elena flinched, as if he had physically struck her, a subtle tremor passing through her frame. But her gaze, when she lifted it to meet his, did not waver. He's just a man looking for a meal, Marcus. It's raining. We have a table. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty in Marcus's eyes was startling. He wasn't just being a manager. He was performing. He was relishing his power, a petty king in a tiny, gilded kingdom, and he needed his subjects to witness his authority. Julian saw in that brief, ugly exchange the entire ecosystem of systemic abuse, the small, daily tyrannies that men in power inflict on those they deem beneath them, simply because they can. A cold, unfamiliar anger began to coalesce in his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to indulge in years. It's fine, Julian said, his voice surprisingly calm and steady. I wouldn't want to cause any trouble for your staff. He looked at Elena, a flicker of silent communication passing between them. Thank you. He turned to leave, but her quiet act of defiance had planted a seed in the barren soil of his evening. He had come out tonight seeking the ghost of his mother, and had instead stumbled upon a raw, living drama of human struggle. He now had a reason to be here. He walked out into the rain, letting the heavy doors swing shut behind him. The image of Elena's resilient face and Marcus's contemptuous sneer burned into his mind. He wasn't just going to acquire this hotel chain anymore. He was going to dismantle it from the inside out and see what secrets it held. The next day, Julian Croft, the reclusive billionaire whose face was known only from a handful of outdated photographs, ceased to exist. In his place was John Anderson, a man with a carefully fabricated resume detailing a string of dead-end jobs, a man whose backstory spoke of bad luck and quiet desperation. His head of security, a formidable ex-Mossad agent named David Chen, had orchestrated the transformation with terrifying efficiency. David was more than an employee. He was the only person Julian trusted implicitly, a man of few words and decisive action who had been with him for over a decade. Are you absolutely certain about this, Julian? David had asked, his brow furrowed as he watched the billionaire practice a defeated slouch in front of a mirror. There are other ways. We could send in an operative. We could launch a formal audit. No, Julian had replied, his voice firm. An auditor sees numbers. An operative sees what they're looking for. I need to see the things no one is looking for. I need to feel it. I haven't felt anything real in years, David. So, John Anderson was born. His appearance was altered subtly, but effectively. A scruffy beard that obscured the sharp line of his jaw, plain glasses that dulled the intensity of his gaze, and a wardrobe of worn, ill-fitting clothes sourced from a thrift store. He looked tired, beaten down, and, most importantly, utterly invisible. He applied for a position as a kitchen porter at the Gilded Compass and, to the surprise of no one, was hired on the spot with a cursory glance at his fake documents. The bowels of the Gilded Compass were a world away from the shimmering opulence of its dining room. It was a subterranean kingdom of scalding steam, the percussive clang of steel pans, the roar of industrial dishwashers, and the simmering, unspoken resentment of the overworked and underpaid. Here, Marcus Thorne's tyranny was not veiled by false hospitality. It was raw and absolute. Julian. Now John spent his days scrubbing pots and pans with hands that were soft and unaccustomed to such punishing labor. His muscles screamed in protest. His back ached constantly. But through the pain, he watched. He listened. He saw Marcus publicly humiliate a young busboy, a kid no older than 19, for a single dropped fork, making him pick up the shards of shattered porcelain with his bare hands. He saw him dock a dishwasher's pay for being 3 minutes late, despite the man pleading that his subway train had been delayed. He saw him leer at the younger waitresses, his compliments laced with a slimy, predatory edge that made their skin crawl. The fear in the kitchen was a tangible thing, a metallic taste in the air that mingled with the smell of grease and bleach. And he saw Elena. In this oppressive, high-pressure environment, she moved with a quiet, efficient grace. She was a consummate professional, her smile for the customers a well-worn mask that would fall the moment she passed through the swinging kitchen doors, replaced by a look of weary resolve. But here, in the trenches, her true character shone through. Julian watched as she discreetly shared her meager staff meal with a new prep cook who couldn't afford to buy lunch until his first paycheck. He saw her slip a $20 bill from her own hard-earned tips into the apron pocket of a crying waitress who had been unjustly berated by Marcus. He overheard her arguing fiercely, albeit quietly, with the kitchen dispatcher, ensuring that a young busboy got credited for the tables he had cleared, tables Marcus was trying to assign to one of his favorites. She was the quiet, defiant heart of this broken place, a force of decency in a system meticulously designed to crush it. He learned her story in fragments, in whispered conversations over the clatter of the kitchen. She was a single mother. Her son, Leo, was her entire world. She worked double shifts 6 days a week, juggling childcare with a neighbor, all to afford a tiny apartment in a distant borough and to keep Leo in a decent daycare. She never complained. She just worked, her movements fueled by a fierce, quiet love. One evening, as Julian was hauling a heavy bin of trash to the dumpsters in the alley, he saw a small, folded note fall from the pocket of Elena's coat as she hung it in her locker. After she had gone, he picked it up. It was a crudely drawn picture of a superhero with a red cape, and underneath, in a child's shaky scrawl, it read, "For Mama, the bravest hero, I love you, Leo." Julian stood there in the grimy hallway, the small piece of paper feeling heavier than a bar of gold in his hand. This simple, discarded drawing told him more about the stakes of his investigation than any financial report ever could. It was her why, and he felt a fierce, protective instinct rise within him, an emotion he had thought long dead. His parallel investigation, conducted with surgical precision by David on the outside, began to yield disturbing results. David, a ghost in the digital world, sliced through the restaurant's firewalls with ease. The payroll and tipping systems were a masterclass in sophisticated fraud. A custom-written algorithm was diverting a significant percentage of all credit card tips, sometimes as high as 40% on a busy weekend night, into a separate, hidden holding account before the remainder was distributed to the staff. It was a digital skimming operation, expertly concealed within layers of seemingly innocuous code. The cash tips were managed with a more primitive, but no less effective, brand of theft. Marcus would collect all cash from the servers at the end of the night for pooling and equitable distribution. But the numbers the staff saw on their pay stubs at the end of the week never quite seemed to add up. There were always discrepancies, always excuses, breakage fees, uniform maintenance, administrative charges. But without proof, it was just their word against his, and his word was law. The catalyst, the moment that transformed Julian's mission from a quest for justice into something deeply, inextricably personal, came in a moment of unexpected grace. It was late, well past 1 in the morning. Julian was finishing the last of the floors, the rhythmic slap of the mop, a meditative counterpoint to the ache in his bones. The vast dining room was dark and silent, a ghost of its former self, save for one small corner where a single, low-wattage service light cast a pool of weary, yellow light. Elena was there, meticulously wiping down the last of the silver. Beside her, fast asleep, on 2 velvet chairs pushed together, was a small boy of about 5, a worn teddy bear clutched in his arms. It had to be Leo. Her babysitter must have had an emergency. Presumably thinking she was completely alone, lost in the weary solitude of her work, she began to hum. It was a soft, gentle melody that flowed into the cavernous silence of the room, a tune so delicate it felt like it could shatter. And then, Julian's world, the carefully constructed world of Julian Croft, and the miserable, temporary world of John Anderson simply stopped. It was the song. It wasn't just similar. It wasn't a half-remembered echo. It was the song. Every note, every gentle rise and fall, every unique, slightly melancholic pause. It was exactly as it lived in the most sacred, fractured memory of his childhood. It was his mother's lullaby. The silver locket in his pocket suddenly felt searingly hot against his skin, a branding iron of memory. He froze, hidden in the shadows by the kitchen door, the mop handle slipping from his numb grasp and clattering with a deafening noise onto the polished marble floor. Elena gasped, jumping to her feet, her hand flying to her heart. Her eyes, wide with fright, darted into the darkness and found him. "Oh, John, you scared me half to death." Julian couldn't speak. His throat was a knot of 30 years of grief and confusion. He took a clumsy step forward, out of the shadows and into the pool of dim light, feeling exposed and vulnerable. "The song," he managed to choke out, his voice a raw, broken whisper he didn't recognize as his own. "That song. Where did you learn it?" A strange, protective look immediately came over her face. She instinctively pulled the thin blanket higher over her sleeping son, a lioness shielding her cub. Her voice, when she replied, was guarded and suspicious. "It's just a family song." "Why?" "Please," Julian pressed, his desperation overriding his carefully constructed persona. He took another step closer. "It's important. Where did you hear it?" "My mother sang it to me when I was a little girl," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly, trying to understand his intense reaction. "And her mother sang it to her. Now I sing it to my son, Leo. It helps him sleep." "Does it have a name?" Julian asked, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that made him feel lightheaded. Elena hesitated for a moment, then seemed to decide there was no harm in answering. "No, not really. It's never had a proper name. In our family, we just call it Lilia's song." The name struck him like a physical blow. Lilia, his mother's name. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was a statistical impossibility, a lightning strike in a clear sky. He felt dizzy, the polished floor seeming to tilt and sway beneath his feet. The ghost he had been chasing his entire adult life had just materialized in the most impossible of places. "Lilia," he repeated, the name feeling both foreign and profoundly familiar on his tongue. Before he could ask another question, before he could bridge the chasm of impossibility that had just opened before him, the sharp, authoritative click of expensive shoes echoed from the hallway. Marcus Thorne appeared, his face a thundercloud of irritation. He had clearly come for a final inspection before leaving. "What is the meaning of this?" he snapped, his eyes first landing on the sleeping child, then flicking to Julian. "Elena, I have told you repeatedly, this is a place of business, not a daycare. Your child is not welcome here. And you, he spat, pointing a venomous finger at Julian, your job is to clean, not to stand around harassing the staff. Get back to your work. You are on incredibly thin ice as it is, Anderson. He wasn't harassing me, Elena said immediately, her voice firm, instinctively stepping slightly in front of Julian as if to shield him. We were just talking. I don't pay either of you to talk, Marcus sneered, his gaze dripping with contempt. Especially not to each other. Now, get your son and get out, Elena. And you, he said, turning the full force of his loathing back on Julian. One more mistake, one more toe out of line, and you're gone. And I will personally make sure you never get another job in this city's hospitality industry again. The threat was clear. The power dynamic was absolute. But Marcus, in his arrogant cruelty, had just made a fatal, unknowable error. He had threatened the two people who were now under the invisible, ironclad protection of Julian Croft. As Marcus turned on his heel and stormed off, his footsteps echoing his self-importance, Julian met Elena's eyes. In them, he saw confusion, fear, but also a flicker of gratitude for his presence. He knew, with agonizing certainty, that he couldn't reveal himself. Not yet. The system of corruption was clearly deeper and more rotten than just Marcus's petty cruelties. He had to uncover everything to protect her, to truly achieve justice. Thank you, he said quietly to her, the words carrying a universe of unspoken meaning. For what you said. She just nodded, her focus already back on gently waking her son. As he watched her lift the sleeping boy into her arms, whispering to him and humming that impossible, familiar lullaby under her breath, Julian's mission became diamond hard and crystal clear. This was no longer about a corporate acquisition or avenging a moment of disrespect. It was a reckoning. It was for his mother. It was for Elena. It was for Leo. The investigation, which had been proceeding with methodical precision, now accelerated with a vengeful urgency. David, using the building access Julian had as a low-level employee, managed to bypass the outdated security on a night shift, planting a micro camera in the smoke detector of Marcus's office and a keylogger on his desktop computer. The information began to pour in, a torrent of digital malfeasance. They captured Marcus's password, and with it, they unlocked his master ledger, a password-protected, heavily encrypted file hidden on a remote server. It was the Rosetta Stone of his corruption. It detailed not just the tip skimming, but a systematic wage theft operation that was breathtaking in its audacity. Marcus was falsifying digital timesheets on a massive scale, routinely clocking employees out hours before they actually left, and pocketing the difference in wages. The ledger also contained his leverage, a meticulously maintained file on every single employee. He had copies of immigration papers with looming expiration dates, records of personal loans he had given out at usurious rates, and notes on private conversations he'd overheard, a past mistake, a family problem, a hidden vulnerability. He was using this arsenal of personal information to ensure their silence and compliance. It was a web of calculated, sociopathic exploitation. While David unraveled the intricate financial crimes, Julian tasked another part of his vast security and intelligence team with a different kind of archaeology, digging into the life of Elena's mother, Sophia, and her grandmother. He had to know with absolute certainty how she knew that song. The report came back 3 days later, and as Julian read it in the pre-dawn hours in his small, anonymous, rented apartment, the ghost of his mother finally began to take shape as a real, breathing woman. 35 years ago, a young woman named Lilia Croft, not yet 20 years old, had fled an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes on her back and $47 in her pocket. She was not the ethereal, tragic figure from his memories, but a fighter, a survivor. She had found shelter and a small job as a live-in caregiver for the ailing, elderly mother of a woman named Sophia. During that brief, difficult 6-month period of her life, a time of fear and uncertainty, Lilia had often sung a lullaby from her own childhood to soothe the old woman in her moments of pain and confusion. That lullaby, a melody of hope and resilience passed down through her own family, became a source of comfort for both of them, a small island of peace in a sea of hardship. Lilia had taught the song to Sophia, who had loved its gentle, melancholic beauty and later sang it to her own daughter. That daughter was Elena. It wasn't just his mother's song. It was a song of shared hope, passed from one woman struggling in the dark to another. His mother, whom he had only ever remembered in the context of her wealth and her tragic, untimely death, had a life before him, a story of profound struggle and survival he had never known. The lullaby wasn't just a memory of his loss. It was a living testament to her resilience. The connection to Elena was not one of mere coincidence, but of a shared, hidden legacy of strength passed down through women. Armed with the full, horrifying picture of Marcus's calculated crimes and the profound, personal truth of the lullaby, Julian Croft prepared for the final act. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. He had David arrange it. A mandatory, all-hands staff meeting was called for the Gilded Compass for the following evening, an hour after closing. It was unprecedented. The memo, distributed by the hotel's corporate office, was terse and offered no explanation. The restaurant would be closed to the public for a private corporate event. A wave of panicked energy rippled through the staff. They buzzed with nervous speculation, fearing the worst. Layoffs, pay cuts, a new, even more draconian set of rules. They gathered in the main dining room, the opulent space feeling less like a restaurant and more like an auditorium for a public execution. The crystal chandeliers seemed to cast a cold, interrogating light. Elena stood near the back with a few other waitresses, her face pale with worry, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. Julian, still in his guise as John the porter, stood among the kitchen staff, his face a mask of weary indifference, but his heart a steady, rhythmic drum of anticipation. Marcus Thorne stood at the front of the room, preening. He had clearly spun the situation to his advantage, positioning himself as the liaison for this mysterious corporate event. He believed the meeting was his stage, a chance to assert his dominance in front of the faceless executives he surely imagined were on their way. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice oozing the false sincerity he reserved for wealthy patrons. "As you know, we are constantly striving for excellence here at the Gilded Compass. That is the Meridian standard, and that requires a certain level of performance. Unfortunately, some of you have not been meeting that standard." He was about to launch into a prepared speech, likely to make an example of someone to impress his superiors, when the main doors of the restaurant swung open with a dramatic flourish. In walked Julian Croft. Not John Anderson, the porter, but the Julian Croft from the cover of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He wore a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Marcus's car, the dark fabric seeming to absorb the light around him. His posture was no longer stooped, but ramrod straight, radiating an aura of absolute, unassailable power that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. He was flanked by David Chen and two other stern-faced individuals in dark, conservative suits who looked like they negotiated the fates of companies over breakfast. A collective, audible gasp went through the room. A wave of confusion rippled from person to person as they looked from the powerful, iconic billionaire at the front to the scruffy, familiar kitchen porter at the back, their minds struggling to bridge the impossible cognitive dissonance. Elena's eyes widened, a storm of confusion, disbelief, and dawning realization brewing within them. Marcus Thorne's jaw went slack. His face cycled through a comical, rapid-fire spectrum of shock, disbelief, confusion, and finally, pure, unadulterated animal terror. Mr. Croft, what an incredible honor. We weren't expecting you. I am Marcus Thorne, the general manager." He scurried forward, his hand outstretched, a pathetic, sycophantic grin plastered on his face. Julian walked slowly and deliberately to the front of the room, his polished shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. He ignored Marcus's outstretched hand, his gaze level and as cold as a glacier. He stopped directly in front of him. "I know who you are, Marcus." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. "I have been your kitchen porter for the past 3 weeks," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "My name was John Anderson. I've scrubbed your floors. I've cleaned your grease traps. I've seen exactly how you run this establishment. And I've seen how you treat people. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd of stunned faces until they landed on Elena. He gestured towards her. People like Elena. A woman who shows more integrity, class, and human decency in a single shift than you have displayed in your entire miserable life. He turned his full attention back to Marcus, whose face was now the color of old ash. I also saw your books, the real ones. David stepped forward and placed a sleek tablet on a nearby table. With a single tap, he projected its screen onto the large, cream-colored wall behind the bar, which now served as a makeshift screen. It showed the master ledger, columns of figures, names, dates, the irrefutable, damning proof of the wage theft, the skimmed tips, the offshore account in the Cayman Islands with a current balance of $1,287,452.17. Gasps and murmurs erupted through the staff as they saw their own names next to figures representing the amounts stolen from them over the years. It was validation. It was vindication. The whispers and suspicions they had shared in secret were now displayed in stark, undeniable black and white. That's fabricated. It's a lie. That's not real. Marcus stammered, sweat beading on his forehead and trickling down his temples. Is it? Julian replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. He nodded to the two individuals who had entered with him. These two gentlemen are senior investigators from the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, and there is a forensic accounting team from the IRS currently securing your office as we speak. All of your records, both digital and physical, have been seized under a federal warrant. As if on cue, two uniformed NYPD officers entered the restaurant and stood impassively by the door. Their presence, a final, unarguable statement. The trap was sprung. The showdown was here. The king of the gilded compass was naked, his power stripped away in a matter of seconds. Marcus crumpled. The smug tyrant vanished, replaced by a pathetic, whimpering man. Please, Mr. Croft, I can explain. It was a misunderstanding. Explain it to them, Julian said, nodding towards the officers. They moved forward with practiced efficiency, read him his rights in a flat monotone, and cuffed his hands behind his back. As they led him away, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with the quiet, ignominious click of handcuffs. A wave of profound catharsis washed over the room. The tension that had held them all captive for so long finally broke. Some staff members began to cry openly, tears of relief and disbelief. Others hugged each other, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning joy. It was the sudden, shocking release of years of pent-up fear, humiliation, and injustice. Julian turned to address the stunned employees, his voice now losing its icy edge and taking on a tone of sincere authority. My name is Julian Croft, and as of last week, my company completed its quiet acquisition of the Meridian Hotel Group, including the Gilded Compass, which means, he said, letting the words sink in, that I am your new employer. He laid out his plan with clear, decisive language. Every single employee would be reimbursed for every dollar that had been stolen from them, with interest and significant punitive damages paid out of a fund he was personally establishing. An independent, third-party auditor would be brought in to create a new, completely transparent system for wages and tips, a system the employees themselves would help design and ratify. The disgusting leverage files Marcus kept would be located and permanently destroyed. A new, empowered human resources department, one that actually protected employees rather than the management, would be instated. He was not just removing the tumor, he was irradiating the cancer and rebuilding the entire system from the ground up based on dignity and respect. After the room had cleared, with the staff chattering in a daze of disbelief and celebratory relief, Julian approached Elena. She had remained behind, standing alone, looking at him with an unreadable expression. Her son, Leo, who had been waiting quietly in the staff room, now stood beside her, holding her hand tightly and looking up at Julian with wide, curious eyes. "John? Or Julian?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. I don't understand." Julian's gaze softened, the corporate titan receding, leaving only the man who had been searching for a ghost. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn silver locket. He opened it and showed her the faded, treasured picture of the young woman inside. "This was my mother," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Her name was Lilia." Elena's eyes widened as the final, impossible piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Lilia's song," she breathed. "She worked for your grandmother a very long time ago," Julian explained gently, his voice low and intimate. "She was running from a difficult life. She had nothing. Your family, your grandmother Sophia, showed her kindness when no one else in the world would. She taught your mother that song. It was a song she used to sing to me before she was gone. For 30 years, I thought that melody, that piece of her, was gone from the world forever. You gave it back to me, Elena." Tears welled in Elena's eyes and began to trace paths down her weary face. Not tears of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of connection, of a story so much larger and more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. "I am not offering you charity, Elena," Julian said, his voice firm but full of warmth. "I am repaying a debt of kindness my mother received that, in turn, you showed to a drenched, broken-looking stranger in the rain. I want to establish a trust to fund Leo's education, all of it, through to whatever university he chooses. And I want to give you a choice. I can offer you the position of general manager of this entire hotel with a mandate to run it with the compassion and integrity you've already shown. Or, he paused, if you have a dream of your own, a dream that this life has forced you to put aside, I can provide the capital to make it happen. No strings attached. Consider it an investment in a legacy of kindness that started long before either of us were born. Elena looked around the grand, empty dining room, a place that had been the backdrop for so much of her misery and struggle. Then she looked down at her son, at his trusting, upturned face, and a slow, radiant smile spread across her own. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated hope. I've always wanted to open a small place of my own, she said, her voice filled with a strength and confidence he hadn't heard before. A little bistro, simple, good food. A place where people feel welcome the moment they walk in the door, no matter what they're wearing. Months later, Julian Croft sat at a corner table in a cozy, bustling restaurant in Greenwich Village. The sign outside, painted in a warm, inviting script, read, Lilia's Song. The air inside smelled of fresh bread, roasting chicken, and melted butter. It was filled not with the tense silence of fine dining, but with the easy laughter and loud, happy conversation of families and friends. He watched Elena, not in a starched waitress's uniform, but in a chef's apron, her face flushed with heat and happiness, moving through her restaurant, with the pride and grace of a queen in her rightful kingdom. From the small, open kitchen, as she plated a dish for a waiting customer, he could hear her humming. It was the lullaby. The sound no longer felt like the haunting of a painful memory, the ghost of what was lost. It was alive, a warm and vibrant thread connecting a mother he had lost, a woman he had found, and the enduring, miraculous truth that the quietest acts of decency can echo through generations, creating a justice and a beauty that all the money in the world could never hope to purchase. His faith, not in systems or in wealth, but in the simple, resilient goodness of people, was finally, blessedly restored.